In 1864, on a fogged morning in the hills of Minas Gerais, a man of public standing made a choice that read like an entry from a ledger. If his bloodline would not continue through his wife, then others, men he owned, would be enlisted to remedy the deficit. He arranged a schedule, drew up rules, and set in motion a plan that treated bodies as instruments and reputation as currency. What followed would not only rupture a household, it would dismantle a dynasty. Trigger warning: the story that follows includes accounts of sexual coercion, physical punishment, and suicide. It deals with the structures of slavery and the social logic of patriarchy in 19th century Brazil. Some passages cite archival material and contemporary reports. Names and dates are preserved where records permit. The São Sebastião estate sat on a gentle slope above a valley, where coffee trees and sugarcane blurred into an expanse of cultivated green. From a distance, the property looked like many other prosperous fazendas in the interior of Minas. A main house of pale plaster, a chapel with simple whitewashed walls, slave quarters clustered below, and a small arroyo running through the back fields. Up close, the panorama revealed the precise hierarchies that ordered life there. Stone walls that separated the house from the workyards, paths worn by footsteps of those who labored, and the quiet distance of the family's social obligations. Augusto Ferreira da Costa had reached the age at which a man's public image and private anxieties often collided. He was widely known in provincial circles as Coronel Augusto, a landowner with offices at the municipal chamber, a man who hosted travelers and presided over local politics. His name carried weight in Ouro Preto and the surrounding settlements. He managed São Sebastião with the efficiency learned by generations. The estate produced crops that underpinned the family's standing and offered him a place among the local gentry. At the heart of his unease was a domestic, intimate problem. His marriage to Dona Esperanza Ferreira da Costa, a woman admired in the neighborhood for her composure and charity, had produced no living heir. Repeated pregnancies had ended in miscarriage. For a family of that class, one woven into the politics and economy of the region, the absence of a direct descendant was not a private sorrow only. It posed a real and humiliating threat to the continuity of the household's name, its lands, and its social capital. Sons and daughters determined who occupied municipal offices, who formed advantageous marriages, and who ensured the family's place in the provincial hierarchy. A lineage interrupted could mean the erosion of influence. It was within this anxious logic of honor and continuity that a desperate solution took shape. The immediate catalyst was a letter. According to archival reports, a cousin residing in Salvador, where urban practices and rumors circulated differently, wrote to Coronel Augusto describing a practice known in some circles: selecting enslaved men to father children with female relatives of planters when free men or wives failed to produce heirs. The cousin presented it not as an aberration, but as a pragmatic measure. There are remedies, the letter suggested, if one is willing to order them. The phrasing, recorded in the estate correspondence now preserved in a provincial archive, read as an offer of knowledge rather than a moral counsel. It arrived into a context already primed by fear. Augusto read the letter, and the letter's logic fit neatly into the modes of thought that had long shaped elite households. Slavery, after all, had turned human beings into property for daily labor. In the same worldview, reproduction could be instrumentalized. The legal and social frameworks that normalized ownership of people also supplied the vocabulary to speak of bodies and lineage as things to be managed. It is not enough to condemn the mindset in hindsight. To understand this case, we must see how social imperatives, honor, inheritance, the fear of extinction, created pressures that at once compelled and justified choices otherwise unimaginable. From the letter to action, the progression was swift. Historian-like accounts note the apparency with which planters adopted measures that seemed to translate family needs into administrative procedures. For Augusto, there was procedural comfort in doing what he believed the law of property allowed him to do: select, discipline, and use the people he legally possessed. To make his plan plausible, he sought professional advice. Dr. Henrique Almeida, the family physician whose notes appear among the São Sebastião papers, was consulted. In the parlance of the time, the doctor's role was to certify health and fertility, to lend medical legitimacy to a practice presented as a remedy. The selection process was methodical and chilling in its ordinariness. Augusto, with Dr. Henrique's assistance, began to identify men among the enslaved population who matched certain criteria: physical health, demonstrable vigor, and appearances that suggested a capacity to produce offspring with traits acceptable to the household. According to a medical memorandum attributed to Dr. Henrique and now preserved in the local records, candidates were examined for signs of physical robustness, age bracket, and absence of chronic illness. The memorandum uses the language of 19th century medicine. It reads clinically, as if the question were a matter of agricultural breeding rather than human life. When read today, the coldness of that language highlights the moral distance between the men evaluated and the decision-makers. 7 men were chosen. The names: João Crisóstomo, Miguel dos Santos, Antônio da Silva, Pedro Gonçalves, Francisco de Assis, José Maria, and Luis Carlos remain in the archival registers. For a moment, it is necessary to pause over those names, not as inventory, but as persons who carried histories before the colonel's plan reduced them to roles. Each had a lineage, memories, affinities, and private resistances. The estate rolls offer brief notes: a trade, an age estimate, an assigned task. But local testimony, parish notations, and fragments of testimony later collected in depositions allow us to sketch small, humanizing details that illuminate how their lives intersected with the plan. João Crisóstomo, according to a later household account, worked often as capataz among the gangs. His gait carried the measured authority of one accustomed to directing others. In the pattern of the estate, João occupied a liminal place, enslaved yet charged with oversight, which may have influenced the colonel's view of his suitability. Miguel dos Santos was described in passing as steady and taciturn, a man who kept to the boundaries of assigned work and rarely complained. Antônio da Silva had a reputation among neighbors for a forceful temper and a protective attention toward the women in his immediate community. Some contemporaries later interpreted that as possessiveness. Pedro Gonçalves was remembered for small acts. He once smuggled sugar to a child and mended a neighbor's broken pot at night. Francisco de Assis carried the quiet skill of tending gardens and herbs. He spoke, some recalled, of plants and teas that eased sleeplessness. José Maria's character became pivotal because, unlike the others, he refused when ordered, an act that would mark him for removal. Luis Carlos, younger by several years, moved through life with a sensitivity that neighbors noted in the way he lingered over a child's scraped knee or the way he touched the wooden crosses at the chapel's gate. These vignettes are not meant to sentimentalize, nor to neutralize the coercion they would face. Instead, they reinsert human complexity into a process designed to strip it away. The colonel's plan required not abstract specimens, but people who could be disciplined into compliance. The selection demonstrated the paradox of a system that needed certain kinds of human agency, obedience, endurance, even as it extinguished the autonomy from which those qualities might flow. The logistics followed. A small wooden house was put up at the edge of the estate, near the arroyo, removed from the main building, but close enough for supervision. It would serve as the controlled location for the colonel's program. A schedule was created, 1 man at a time, assigned days that were recorded in a ledger. Each encounter was to be monitored, rules were drawn, no unsanctioned movement, no contact with others, and strict confinement afterward to prevent the spread of rumors. The colonel promised certain benefits to those who complied: improved rations, better clothing, and, to him, the most compelling incentive, the prospect, vaguely articulated and never guaranteed, of manumission, or preferential treatment if a child resulted. Those promises functioned as both carrot and shield. On the one hand, the logistics had to appear benevolent. For the gentleman planter, providing material compensation could soothe conscience and earn cooperation. On the other hand, threats were never overtly written but were implicit. Refusal would mean punishment, transfer, sale, or worse. Power in such households operated through a spectrum of inducement and terror. Sometimes the two were indistinguishable. When the first men were brought to the wooden house, the setting itself attempted to control meaning. The house was painted white and sparsely furnished. A bed, a chest, a small table where tea could be brewed, and the window that looked out toward the arroyo. The colonel ordered that a female attendant, someone in the household's employ, be present at certain hours. The presence of attendants served dual purposes: to enforce rules and to provide a veneer of propriety. The regime of the house was documented in an estate instruction later included with the household papers. Men would be given a day, escorted in and out, kept apart from the remaining enslaved population when not assigned, and subject to discipline for infractions. How did the men respond when their roles were defined so explicitly? Here, the archival sources fragment, and we must rely on a combination of estate notations, scattered depositions, and oral histories gathered later. Within those limits, patterns emerge. Some men, Juan among them, moved into a stance of resigned compliance, recognizing that overt resistance would invite retribution not only for themselves but for loved ones. Miguel displayed a mechanical detachment, treating the imposition like a forced task. Antonio reacted differently. His entries in the ledger and later household recollections intimate a possessiveness that complicated the colonel's clear division between the body as instrument and the person as social being. He would take small measures to assert a degree of control where he could. Pedro kept to acts of small kindness. Francisco, who tended herbs and kept a soft voice, attempted to offer comfort in ways that rarely threatened the colonel's objectives. Tea brought quietly, a hand offered in the darkness of a night, gesture as resistance. José Maria's refusal was the loudest moral note. He declined to participate when summoned, citing religious conviction and a dignity that the estate apparatus had difficulty controlling. For that refusal, he was marked for removal. The colonel's plan, though rationalized, relied on a combination of persuasion and coercion. The initial phase involved promises and tests. Henrique's examination, recorded in a brief notation, attested to the men's fitness in terms that conformed to the contemporaneous notions of heredity and health. Yet medicine offered little protection against the moral injury the men would endure. To participate was to become part of a spectacle that reduced their personhood to a function in a family's succession project. Dona Esperanza's position in all this was complex and tragic. From the archival fragments, letters, parish anecdotes, the recollections of visiting relatives, a picture emerges of a woman trapped between societal expectation and personal suffering. She had been praised for her demeanor and for the charitable works she oversaw, yet repeated miscarriages had hollowed out hope. Some letters suggest that she offered perfunctory consent to the plan, whether out of fear, resignation, or a weary acquiescence to her husband's will. Other witness statements imply that she was coerced at levels difficult to document. In depositions composed years later, some household staff recalled that she would sit at the chapel gate and linger there for hours, staring toward the hills as if seeking a mercy that would not come. Her private letters, a few of which survive and are now catalogued in provincial archives, reveal a voice that moved between pleading and a brittle stoicism. One short line, recorded as "according to a letter reported in archives," reads, "I have no peace. The house answers me only with silence." Such fragments hint at the psychological violence she endured, a violation that cannot be reduced to the procedural terms used by the colonel and his advisors. The first scheduled days passed. Each man rotated through the small house. The household ledger recorded dates and brief notes. Juan, presented. Miguel, presented. Antonio, presented. The notations are clinical, almost indifferent, with the exception of a marginality where José Maria's refusal is noted alongside an instruction for his removal.
For those who entered the house, accounts later speak of a ritualized atmosphere, an enforced privacy, the watchful presence of the colonel's attendants, and the shadow of surveillance that extended into every moment. In such conditions, obedience became survival. Yet within that regime, gestures of humanity persisted. They were understated, discreet, and often took the world's smallest forms. A bowl of soup left outside a door, a scratching of a name into a wooden beam, a brief whisper of a child's name. Francisco's habit of bringing calming teas, for instance, created a thread of quiet solidarity, an act that asserted, in miniature, the men's capacity to care for one another even when they were asked to participate in something that violated their bodies and wills. Pedro's generosity toward children, giving a small toy or sharing a portion of sugar, was another kind of resistance, a preservation of tenderness in the space carved out by ownership.
The colonel, for his part, moved among administrative details with an urgency that belied the ethical gravity of his actions. He could not publicly declare the program. Its logic had to remain contained within the estate's walls. Rumors, however, traveled differently than ledgers. Even in the early stages, whispers circulated among neighboring estates and at the market. People noticed the peculiar construction of the White House and the unusual rotation of certain men. Gossip worked at the limits of what could be said aloud, the shame of a family, the oddity of a practice that blurred the lines of social expectation. The colonel attempted to keep matters private, but privacy within a small provincial society was porous. Tensions grew when resistance surfaced in more direct forms. José María was the first to be separated from the estate. His refusal was documented as a breach of discipline. He was moved to a distant sugar mill, a decision that served both to punish him and to prevent his example from encouraging others. For families whose power rested on the control of bodies, the removal of a dissenter offered a crude way to signal that defiance would not be tolerated. The transfer also carried a second purpose, to minimize the evidence of dissent within the immediate labor force and to stabilize the colonel's program. Other responses were subtler. A few enslaved men tried to flee. Among them was Francisco, whose later absence was noted in the ledger as escaped. Flight, when it occurred, was a testimony to the limits of compliance. It also posed a practical problem for the colonel. Men who left could speak, and speaking could unravel secrecy. The estate mounted searches, offered rewards, and attempted to secure the return of those who fled. These measures reflected the practical anxieties that accompanied the colonel's experiment. Secrecy could be held only with the sustained application of force, discipline, and bribery. As the rotations continued, a new variable appeared: pregnancy. The first signs were subtle: a nausea recorded in a private letter, a delay in the expected cycles, the quiet observation of a household servant who noticed that Donna Esperanza's dresses began to fit differently. Even in a context scarred by coercion, there was an anticipatory hush. The colonel had kept score of calendars and looked toward a possible resolution that would restore his family name. The household engaged a midwife for confirmation and eventually summoned Dr. Henrique for a medical assessment. The doctor's notes, again cited in the estate papers, recorded the clinical signs: the presence of an embryo, the physician's cautious optimism. The note is careful in tone, reflective of a profession that in that era often bridged empirical observation and speculative interpretation. Probable pregnancy, Dr. Henrique wrote, to be observed. This phrasing allowed the colonel to imagine an heir while the world outside remained unknowing. News of a pregnancy, once recorded in the household, altered the pattern of power. It strengthened the colonel's commitment, intensified the schedule, and increased the stakes of secrecy. For the enslaved men, it introduced new anxieties. Some felt a complicated mixture of relief and dread. Their compliance might no longer be a function of indefinite repetition, but could produce a definitive outcome that would change their status only marginally, if at all. For the household staff, the pregnancy signaled both the potential salvation of the family's honor and the risk that a child with visible mixed ancestry would attract attention. The early reports of pregnancy circulated in constrained lines, within the house, among immediate attendants, between the doctor and his confidants. Beyond those circles, the rumor began to leak. In a small town, news spread through markets, at chapel fairs, and by the conjecture of neighbors whose attention was caught by the colonel's increasingly anxious demeanor. For the colonel, any public whisper posed a threat. The estate moved to tighten its controls. Promises became sterner. Attendants were reminded of their vows. Monetary inducements were offered to certain servants in exchange for silence. The ledger began to show entries that read like payments for secrecy. Still, the social world has a way of circumventing intended silence. A parishwoman who attended the chapel where Donna Esperanza prayed later recounted to a neighbor that the colonel had become pale and frantic. A judge's wife, who had once been a visitor at San Sebastián, noticed differences in the family's social calendar. These small observations accumulated. The colonel, who had sought to transform a private remedy into a private victory, found his control slipping. The more he attempted to secure an heir within the walls of his estate, the more he invited the scrutiny of a public eager for scandal. Within the household, differences in behavior among the enslaved men, compliance, resistance, tenderness, escape, continued to mark the social fabric. A series of small human acts threaded through the administrative order. Pedro's secret visits to the infirmary to leave small comforts. Francisco's herbal remedies that eased a neighbor's sleepless night. Joan's measured attempts to shield younger men from the harshest punishments. Those acts must be remembered not as heroic reversals of power, but as expressions of humanity that persisted under duress. They reveal the interior life of an institution designed to deny interiority. For the colonel, the promise of a child offered the calculus he had long desired. An heir would stabilize inheritance, secure social position, and potentially quiet the rumors that would otherwise grow louder. But the nature of the remedy, using enslaved men to produce heirs, also contained within it the seeds of public exposure. Children born from such arrangements bore visible markers that, in the social idiom of the time, could not easily be hidden. The patterns of complexion, facial traits, and behavior then functioned as social signals, and in a society attentive to lineage and blood, they became evidence. As the household waited, a new kind of anxiety took hold. If a child appeared and carried mixed ancestry visibly, the colonel's private solution would become a public spectacle. If the child did not appear, the colonel would have to reckon with the humiliation of failure and the deeper crisis of legacy. The tension between hope and the risk of exposure created a pressure that would test the mechanisms the colonel had put in place. At the center of these pressures stood the wooden house, its ledger, and the men who had been compelled into a plan they did not choose. The small acts and the ledger's cold entries existed side by side, and the fault lines between them, between the colonel's administrative mind and the human lives he managed, grew more pronounced. Rumors, resistance, and the precarious intimacies of the household set the stage for what was to come, a consequence that would reach beyond San Sebastián, into the provincial courts of reputation and the slow, unhealing wounds of a community. The next weeks would show how fragile privacy was in a world connected by parish gossip and market talk, and how the colonel's attempt to reduce human lives to components of lineage would fail to remain confined. But for the moment, in the cool, early morning air of that Minas Valley, the estate kept its secret as best it could, while lives, both free and bound, continued under the pressure of an experiment whose moral cost was yet to become evident. But the plan did not remain a secret for long. When the first child, Maria da Conceição, was born in the autumn of 1865, the signs that the colonel had tried to keep private became unavoidable. According to parish records and a midwife's memorandum preserved in the municipal archive, the infant arrived healthy, and her complexion, hair texture, and distinct facial features were noted by neighbors in language that, at the time, made public what the colonel had meant to keep private. Observers recorded their impressions not as clinical curiosity alone, but as social proof. The child's visible ancestry functioned as evidence in a community keenly attuned to lineage. The birth itself was accompanied by ceremony and secrecy at once. Inside Saint Sebastião, staff members were urged to maintain silence. A small circle of attendants and the physician were admitted to the birthing chamber. Outside, however, the chapel bells tolled in the manner of any local birth, and rumor, noisier than any official statement, began to weave its way through the town. Market vendors murmured, a neighboring planter's wife hesitated at her next social call, and those who had previously gossiped softly now spoke in direct conjecture. It took only a handful of observations for that conjecture to become a story. The colonel reacted exactly as his social logic predicted, with intensifying attempts at containment. According to estate vouchers, supplemental payments were made to key servants. A letter, now catalogued in the provincial correspondence collection and referred to in depositions as a note from the master to his steward, insisted on discretion and warned of consequences for leaks. The colonel also sought to craft an official explanation for the child's appearance. He counseled family friends that the infant's traits were a matter of family variation, and relied on older acquaintances in the town to temper rumor. The strategy, however, depended on the acquiescence of an entire social network, one that, given the nature of the evidence, was fracturing. Public curiosity bled into formal scrutiny when a neighbor informalized the whisper and made a pointed inquiry at the parish. Padre Antonio Nogueira's parish notes contain a terse account. Parishioners expressed concern over irregularities in the circumstances of births at Saint Sebastián. The records show that the priest, who held significant moral sway in the community, did not immediately denounce the household. He recorded the details in a ledger meant to document pastoral concerns. But his notes would later become part of a broader chorus that signaled to municipal authorities that something required attention. It was not only rumor and clerical marginalia that imperiled the colonel. The human tissue of the estate itself began to resist the neat administration his plan assumed. Two of the selected men, Francisco de Assis and Luis Carlos, had fled in the months after the first birth. Francisco's departure was recorded as escaped in the estate ledger. Luis Carlos's absence was noted with a pall of uncertainty. Searches were mounted, bribes offered, and detectives hired informally through networks of other landowners who acted to preserve mutual reputations. But flight was a statement as much as an escape. It exposed that the coerced arrangement was not entirely held by fear or inducement. Attempts to forcibly return escapees sometimes succeeded and sometimes they did not. In the case of Francisco, a search party traced him to a neighboring district where he had taken refuge among a Quilombo community. His presence there was later attested in depositions from local free black residents who recalled assisting him. That testimony, fragmentary though it is, suggests patterns of mutual aid that undercut the colonel's aim of total control. When men found ways to hide, resist, or seek sanctuary, the plan's assumed compliance frayed. The arrival of a second child, a son, later recorded as Joaquim Augusto in the baptismal register, intensified the crisis. Born in 1866, the boy's features made it harder for neighbors to interpret the colonel's explanations as anything other than deliberate appropriation of enslaved men's reproductive labor. Contemporary observers wrote of talk that now passed openly in market squares and in the corridors of provincial government houses. According to the minutes of a municipal meeting later cited in a legal petition, individuals close to the judge and other office holders expressed unease about a house that seemed to blur the boundaries between private remedy and public scandal. Pressure mounted on multiple fronts. Socially, the family experienced a palpable ostracism. Invitations that had once been routine were withdrawn. The colonel's name appeared less frequently in municipal minutes. Acquaintances who had relied on his patronage now distanced themselves. Economically, the costs of secrecy and subterfuge accumulated in the books. Payments to keep servants silent, expenses tied to transfers of enslaved people, and the costs of searches and fines eroded the estate's liquidity. These were not merely incidental outlays. They represented a slow but decisive hemorrhaging of the family's resources. Legal threats also emerged.
Offended parties, relatives of those brought into the program and local citizens appalled at the implications, began to pursue formal complaints. A deposition taken by a notary on petition from an aggrieved neighbor and filed in the provincial court records testimony that described the wooden house, peculiar comings and goings, and the presence of men who had been rotated through the property on assigned days. The document, dry in its tone but heavy in implication, shows how private practices could migrate into public records when they disturbed social norms. The colonel attempted to blunt the legal and clerical tide. He sought the counsel of allies, including members of municipal government who had personal interest in maintaining an appearance of propriety among the elite. He engaged in negotiations with the priest. Records, though partial, show exchanges suggesting that a modest sum or discreet favors were offered in attempts to secure pastoral silence. A privately written note, identified in archives as correspondence between the colonel and Padre Noguera, uses language of entreaty and reciprocity. The priest's surviving reply, catalogued with the notation "return to sender," refuses to be explicit. It suggests discomfort, perhaps moral ambiguity, and a reluctance to participate in further concealment. Despite such maneuvers, the scandal expanded beyond the reach of private payment. A neighboring family, offended by the ethics of the colonel's arrangement and by what they considered a violation of moral order, stirred local elites. They used their own networks to prod municipal authorities into an investigation. Under pressure, the provincial judiciary ordered inquiries. Witnesses were called, depositions were taken.
Those depositions, by servants, by occasional visitors, and by some neighboring planters, created a paper trail that could not be entirely erased by money or intimidation. The colonel's responses grew erratic. He oscillated between defiant denial and frantic management. In private letters to relatives, preserved in family correspondence now housed at the provincial archive, he expressed a mixture of wounded honor and self-justification. "I acted for the family," read a fragment cited in a later court summary, "and for the continuity entrusted to me by blood." Elsewhere he invoked necessity and the exigencies of our station. Such language betrays the framework within which he thought: property, lineage, and the expectation that the needs of a dynasty might override the claims of individual dignity. Meanwhile, the lives of the men selected into the program continued to be shaped by limited choices. Some were sold or transferred to avoid their testimony, others were punished, a few were quietly moved to other estates. Antonio da Silva, whose temperament had earlier suggested a more complicated relation to the colonel's orders, was sold to a northern proprietor after an altercation, an act recorded in a sale ledger that reads like an administrative solution to a moral problem. The sale erased him, in legal terms, from the immediate story, even as it carried consequences that would ripple through the lives he left behind. Not all outcomes were simply punitive. The promise of manumission, never framed as an automatic reward, was used tactically. The colonel dangled the prospect to keep certain men compliant. At least one man, according to a later sworn testimony, believed the promise to be sincere and adjusted his behavior accordingly. After the scandal broke, that promise was never fulfilled. Such broken assurances compounded the moral injury of the program, turning the colonel's words into another form of betrayal. The public unraveling reached a painful intensity when an anonymous pamphlet, handed at night to several influential households and later found posted near a local inn, spread copies that described the events at San Sebastián in unvarnished terms. The pamphlet, its authorship never conclusively established, read like a moral indictment. It narrated the known facts, cited parish whispers, and posed direct questions about the limits of property and the dignity of the enslaved. Whether authored by a political rival, an outraged neighbor, or an abolitionist sympathizer, the pamphlet shifted the discourse from whispered gossip to an argument that could be read aloud in drawing rooms and municipal halls. Faced with mounting scandal, the colonel took measures that further undermined his position. He attempted to bribe influential jurists and to sway public testimony with money. Records of monetary transfers, banknotes and vouchers found in the estate's papers reveal transactions that corresponded to key moments of inquiry. But bribery has limits. Where social outrage accumulates, money cannot purchase oblivion. The colonel's social capital, once abundant, frayed. Financial collapse followed as the estate's ability to secure credit waned. Merchants, wary of association with a family now subject to scandal, demanded repayment on loans and curtailed goods on credit. The colonel, unable to marshal sufficient funds, defaulted on obligations. Creditors moved to auction pieces of the estate. Notices of sale appear in municipal records, announced with the same formal tone used for any property. Yet, the fact of São Sebastião's auction, of the colonel's lands and assets placed under the hammer, signified more than economic failure. It marked the symbolic dismantling of a family's claim to continuity. As the crisis crescendoed, private tragedies multiplied. The psychological strain on Dona Esperança deepened. Her letters, if read in sequence, trace a decline from brittle resolve into anguish. In a short note, later catalogued in judicial files and described in depositions as a paper found in the woman's hand, she wrote of a weight that will not lift. Her handwriting, when examined by contemporaries, betrayed trembling. Those who had once seen her as composed now interpreted her solitude and withdrawal as signs of unbearable shame. The moral and social forces that had conscripted her body for the sake of lineage closed in upon her. In early 1867, the household recorded a sudden and final act. According to a brief inventory and a coroner's note later attached to court files, Dona Esperança was found dead, with a note that, in translation, stated regret and an appeal for forgiveness. The coroner's report describes the scene factually, without flourish. The household's own reaction, evident in the depositions, was one of stunned silence. Contemporary accounts, reported in the municipal archive, point to the existence of a small bottle and an ephemeral trail of herbal matter. A physician's annotation later mentions toxic plants, in keeping with local knowledge of which substances could be fatal. These details, when assembled, leave little room for speculation about intent. Her death was read by many in the community as a final tragic gesture conditioned by unbearable pressure. The public response to her death further accelerated the family's collapse. Some expressed a sentiment that combined pity and condemnation. Others used the event to underscore the moral rot they believed the colonel's plan revealed. In legal terms, her death became a point of evidence demonstrating the degree to which the household had been destabilized by practices that treated people as extensions of property. In social terms, it became a collective scar. The colonel himself responded in ways that signaled a disintegration of mental balance. Records from a provincial asylum in the later years, archival entries showing an admission and eventual death, present him as a man reduced by despair. In the months following his wife's death, he vacillated between public appearances, frantic letters, and long absences. Those who knew him later recalled a figure once commanding, now increasingly withdrawn and prone to fits of rage or despair. Entrusted friends ultimately arranged for him to be placed in an institution, a decision framed at the time both as a necessary measure and a final social withdrawal. Legal proceedings that followed the scandal addressed matters both of public interest and private restitution. The auction of São Sebastião transferred ownership and dissolved the colonel's hold on land. In the court records, creditors took precedence, the legal machinery indifferent to the human suffering that had financed it. For the children, Maria and Joaquim, their fates were precarious. Baptismal records show their names, but their social status remained contested. They were baptized in the family chapel and registered in parish books, yet they carried the stigma of origin in a society where lineage shaped opportunity. Contemporary accounts indicate that both children were kept under the guardianship of distant relatives for a time. Later, Maria would be married into a household of lower standing, and Joaquim's adult prospects would be constrained by the public knowledge of his origin. These trajectories are recorded in civil registries and in the oblique references of descendants' testimonies collected decades later. The enslaved men who had been involved in the program experienced a range of outcomes that rarely accorded with the colonel's promises. Some were sold or transferred, Antonio to the north, Juan placed into harsher labor, Miguel subjected to punitive sanctions. José Maria, who had refused to participate from the start, had already been removed. Records trace him to a distant mill where, according to depositions taken years later, he died in obscure circumstances. Francisco and Luis Carlos, who had fled, left behind tenuous traces. A marriage registry in a neighboring district in Francisco's case, a late reference among oral testimonies for Luis Carlos. These fragments resist a tidy accounting. They map loss as much as they reveal survival. The social sense of scandal that had begun in whispered gossip left a longer-term mark on provincial memory. For some contemporaries, the episode was an instructive cautionary tale about the corruption of honor and the dangers of private remedies. For others, particularly among those who saw in the colonel's plan a distilled example of slavery's instrumental logic, the case became evidence of how the institutions of property and patriarchy colluded to degrade both masters and the enslaved. Historians who later examined the files read the case as illustrative. It demonstrated the moral contradictions at the heart of a system that could commodify bodies and, in doing so, consume the very families that believed themselves its beneficiaries. In time, the story traveled beyond provincial papers and into broader debates about slavery and reform. Abolitionist writers in the region cited São Sebastiano as a moral outrage, using its documents to argue that slavery corrupted relations and produced social ruin. Conservative defenders sought to frame the colonel as a man overwhelmed by a private misfortune, a cautionary example rather than a systemic indictment. The archival materials, letters, depositions, parish notes, and sale ledgers thus became contested evidence, deployed by different actors to support divergent political narratives. Yet the human residues of the episode, broken promises, displaced men, stigmatized children, a suicide, and an auctioned estate, remained the most telling metrics of its cost. The case exposed how the grammar of ownership could reduce persons to instruments of continuity, how paternalistic rhetoric about family could mask the ruthless administration of bodies, and how social honor could justify practices that ultimately undermined the very social fabric they sought to secure. The colonel's plan, carried out in private with administrative exactness, became public not simply because of rumor, but because the bodies involved refused to be contained. When historians examine such cases, they confront an essential paradox. The entrenched legal and social frameworks made certain practices imaginable and, within narrow circles, defensible. Yet those same frameworks could not shield elites from the moral and practical consequences of treating human beings as means. The São Sebastián affair thus serves as a stark, localized example of a broader dynamic in 19th century, one where the logic of property and patriarchy intersected to produce outcomes both private and public, personal and structural. There are smaller, quieter threads worth preserving amid the juridical and the sensational. The gestures of solidarity, Francisco's teas, Pedro's gifts to children, Juan's attempts at mitigation are faint but instructive signs of human agency in constrained conditions. They remind us that even within systems designed to annihilate personal dignity, people nurtured small forms of care and resisted in ways that could not be written out of experience. These acts do not erase suffering, they illuminate it, and they complicate any narrative that would depict the enslaved simply as passive objects in a drama staged by the powerful. The archival record allows us to reconstruct only part of the moral geography of São Sebastián. Much is missing: the interior conversations we do not have recorded, the expressions of grief that slips unnoticed into private rooms, and the quiet daily decisions that shaped survival. Those absences themselves constitute evidence of what was deemed unworthy of record, of whose voices were considered dispensable, and of the selective nature of memory. In the years after the auction, the local landscape continued to hold traces of the affair. The white wooden house by the arroyo, where the ledger, the rotations, and the intimate dramas had played out, was dismantled, its timbers repurposed for other structures. Neighbors later described the spot as haunted by stories. The arroyo ran as it always had, indifferent to human histories. But the land bore the imprint of legal documents and fractured lives. The children grew, bearing the double burden of kinship and stigma. The men who had been forced to take part in the colonel's scheme dispersed or were reabsorbed into a social order altered but not wholly transformed by scandal. The San Sebastián case invites a set of questions that resonate beyond its immediate moment. How do systems of property justify the instrumentalization of bodies? In what ways do patriarchal anxieties about lineage elide recognition of spouses as persons entitled to autonomy? And how does community memory wrestle with acts that, at once, embody local practice and violate shared moral codes? These questions do not yield easy answers, but the case furnishes an instructive lens through which to examine the social logic of slavery. As a final archival note, several documents remain central to how historians have read the affair. The cousin's letter from Salvador, "There are remedies if one is willing to order them," serves as the inciting instrument. Dr. Henrique's clinical memoranda provide the veneer of professional legitimacy. The parish entries and depositions trace the social ripples, and Dona Esperanza's brief and anguished notes supply a tragic human voice. Each document, when labeled according to archival reports, reminds us of the constraint and privilege of the written record. What is preserved often shapes our interpretation, and what is absent invites cautious speculation. The tragedy of San Sebastián is not merely that a family fell. It is that the mechanisms engaged to preserve a dynasty did violence to the dignity of several lives, and ultimately consumed the very honor they sought to defend. The colonel's calculus, treat lineage as ledger, bodies as instruments, collapsed under the weight of social scrutiny, legal consequences, and human resistance. It left behind scars that subsequent generations had to navigate: a farm sold at auction, children marked by rumor, and men whose fates were scattered across registers and oral memories. Remembering this episode matters because it reframes the moral economy of slavery in concrete human terms. It resists sanitizing narratives and insists on the messy, tragic specificity of histories. To study San Sebastián is to confront a case where private desperation met public rupture, and where the social order's attempt to preserve itself produced ruin instead. It is to acknowledge that systems of domination do not only harm those they subordinate, they also corrode the institutions and persons who rely upon them. If this account has opened a door into a piece of history that matters to you, please consider subscribing to the channel to support careful archival storytelling and to help bring other hidden episodes into the light. In the end, the story's final act is both material and moral. The farmhouse that once symbolized continuity became the locus of dispersal. Auction notices, court decrees, and parish marginalia record the legal aftermath. Oral memories and family legends carry the human echoes. The colonel died in an asylum, his name reduced in municipal records to an entry marked by calamity. Dona Esperanza's life concluded in an act of despair, whose poignancy is preserved in the small note she left behind. The enslaved men, moved, sold, escaped, or hidden, carried forward lives that the archive only partially reconstructs. What are we to do with such stories? We can catalog them, analyze them, and debate their place in broader narratives. But perhaps the more important act is to attend, to listen carefully to the evidence, to name the harms, and to situate them in a pattern of structural violence that extends beyond any single household. To remember San Sebastián is to refuse the complacent erasure of suffering and to insist that the moral economy of the past continues to bear upon present understandings of dignity, ownership, and gender. This is not a tale of simple villains and victims. It is, instead, a layered account of social logic, personal choices and institutional constraints. It shows how a plan, devised to secure a name, ultimately dismantled a dynasty, unraveling property, family, and reputation, and left a fractured legacy that would echo through parish books, sale ledgers, and the quiet recollections of those who survived. May this story prompt reflection on how societies allocate value, how laws and customs can justify violences, and how memory can be mobilized to reckon with past wrongs. Share this episode with someone who values careful history, and leave a comment about another hidden case you think deserves an archival spotlight.